Welcome to Chapter 1 of The Default Life by Sam McLoughlin, read by the author. Chapter 1 is called On Religion, or Me, Myself, and iGod. There is a recommended listening portion to this chapter. The song recommended is Clark Gable by the Postal Service, because I think it's a tragedy that movies can have soundtracks and books can't. The lyrics that I wanted to emphasize from this song are, I want so badly to believe that there is truth and love is real, and I want life in every word to the extent that it's absurd. Thank you, Ben Gibbard. So moving on to the actual chapter. So you heard it was a white lion? Yes. White? Yes. So the guy was just walking down the road in the middle of the night, came across a white lion, fainted, and then fell into a ditch. Then when he woke up, he went straight home and killed himself? Yes. How? The usual. A rope in a tree. At least that's what I heard. And this is because a witch doctor cursed his family by pouring rabbit's blood all over their yard? Yes. How many houses down was this? 3. Wow, this is a strange place. Yeah, you could say that. The words hung in the air for a few seconds before slowly dissipating behind the walls. The gentle hum of the ceiling fan, that familiar blanket of white noise, was noticeably absent. An eerie silence had emerged, framing the scene like a film noir. We stirred our cups of instant coffee and stared at the flickering candle, a modest distraction from the grisly thoughts that still lingered in the air like puffs of smoke. Just then, urgent shouts erupted outside the door. Like whiplash, they shook us from our somber mood. We scurried outside to join 24 or so students sprinting towards the entrance gate at the other side of the Bible college. Upon arrival, breathless and confused, we strained our ears to listen as we filled our lungs with the brisk night air. One of the older students was negotiating with 3 terrified teenage girls who were virtually trying to scale the huge concrete walls that buffered us from the outside world, walls more suggestive of a medium-security prison rather than a college. The girls had just raced from the Boy Scout-type camp from up the road. They testified through shrieks and whines to having barely escaped from being tortured in a ritualistic witchcraft ceremony. They claimed that they'd cried out to Jesus for help, when suddenly everyone in the house went blind, giving them just enough time to run like the Dickens for our little college down the road. They thought we'd grant them asylum or something. We were, after all, at a Bible college. But to quote Leonardo DiCaprio in Blood Diamond, TIA, this is Africa. Things are never that simple. Still panting, my friend Koopa and I noticed aloud, oh, so that's why the power keeps going out around 8. Witchcraft ceremonies, I suppose, are best performed in the dark. In Africa, there is usually a, finger quote, rational explanation for these things. We were quickly ushered back to our rooms. Once the commotion had died down, we decided to sneak out and jog in the direction of the scout camp to see if we could spot any witch doctors or white lions, bravely flaunting our fearless, skeptical egos reared on countless Indiana Jones viewings. Alas, we met no strange creatures prowling the dark, moon-bathed road that connected the college with a few rural houses bravely staggered on the outskirts of town. Exactly what we'd done if we had encountered such a beast, real or imaginary, hadn't crossed our minds. The sheer possibility seemed absurd. However, in this place, I knew that almost anything was possible. In this place, life wasn't repetitive or comfortable or predictable. It was dark and dangerous. It was mysterious and kind of fun. I'd come to Africa to see my childhood best friend for the first time in 9 years. I also came for an adventure, and that's exactly what I found. A few days after the White Lion incident, we made our way through an uncivilized sector of northern Zambia. Koopa, his younger brother Lumino, and I had driven through swamps and forests, over hazardous roads and past roadblocks manned by red-eyed soldiers hiked up on cheap drugs. We were conducting a tour of Zambia's largely undiscovered waterfalls, led by their father, a gregarious preacher who knew people in every town and village along the way. We stopped in villages to eat fish and potatoes. We played games with the kids and gave out cheap Hot Wheels replicas we'd bought in town. We swam underneath waterfalls, the only pools of water in Zambia where crocodiles and snakes choose not to reside. We even met with a real tribal chief. As we were driving home, the sunset cast a glow over a hilly plain of sparse trees and jungle brush. We stopped to walk around for a few moments, to watch, to sip slowly from this beauty that glowed so fully in a land so far removed from my own. At that moment, I felt overwhelmed by a disorienting rush of life. For just a few seconds, I became staggeringly bemused by the concept of existence, by the utter strangeness of it all. I wanted to live in this moment forever, to scrape out and savor every sight, every sound, every shivering feeling. And it occurred to me why I liked this place so much, why I casually shrugged off warnings of malaria and civil war and certain death and hopped a plane over the Atlantic. Here there were no billboards, no advertisements, no talk radio stations, no traffic cops or even speed limits. There weren't even caution signs. Even in town, I couldn't get the internet if I'd tried, and their TV programming was dreadful. The beauty of life, it turns out, is much easier to appreciate when removed from the pervasive din of cell phones, TVs, and traffic. Here, the wisdom and experience I'd accumulated in the 18 years up to this point began to crystallize into insight. Life is not suited for the synthetic ecosystem we call suburbia. It isn't suited for the American default mode for washing our minds in noisy distractions and coaching ourselves in stimulating comfort. It's suited for something much deeper and dangerous. I'm suited for something much deeper and dangerous. You won't listen to reason, he said, raising his voice before sipping his pint of Guinness like a true Irishman. Ronan abandoned Christianity a few years ago. He was raised Catholic in Ireland, but moved to Canada 10 years previous. His accent wasn't thick, but still, I envied it. I bet girls would like me if I could talk like Colin Farrell. Or if I looked like Colin Farrell. Yeah, well, your mom doesn't listen to reason, I replied. The first time I met Ronan, I told him I thought his name was really cool. He told me that in Japan it means rogue assassin, but in Gaelic it means baby seal. How would you like to be named after a baby seal? Still, you could get all the ladies if you moved to Tokyo, I said. Ronan was the smartest of the bunch in our quirky group of amateur philosophers, a ragtag bunch noticeable for our indifference to fashion, exercise, and the typical university student aptitude for binge drinking. Ronan wasn't the only post-Christian in the bunch. Kevin had dated a Christian and flirted with belief for a couple of years, before succumbing to intellectual honesty like the rest of them. 4 to 5 Christians give up on Christianity while at university, or so I've heard. My experience confirms this. Aside from a couple of staunch Catholics, I alone remained steadfast in the faith, which made for great entertainment amongst my friends. Convincing me to become an atheist became like an after-class noon-hour ritual over beers and late breakfast on Fridays. They would take turns finding new ways to politely explain to me that the idea of God has become an obsolete notion, untenable for anyone who aspires to have an ounce of intellectual credibility. The arguments shifted between the usual suspects. There's too much evil in the world to be a god. Or all we need to do is believe in the progress of science and technology. Or we don't really need God to be moral. You know the rest. I learned to laugh at the futility and novelty of their efforts. I began to enjoy hearing about how evil and stupid my God was, and about how this evil, stupid God was really just a crutch I made up because I have unresolved issues with my parents and my sexuality and never overcame my childhood fear of King Kong. My atheist compadres claimed to empathize with me, explaining in a patronizing manner that I couldn't help it, that I was just brought up this way, and if I'd been brought up Jewish or Muslim or Wiccan, then I'd be one of those religions. I guess I couldn't find the courage to reject my upbringing and face the dangerous, romantic, seize-the-day existence of meaninglessness that comes with being a disciple of the one true God, namely Nietzsche. But we are all products of our environments, aren't we? Occasionally I try to muster a defense and brandish the Lord, liar, or lunatic argument I'd learned that time we did apologetics at Christian middle school. When relativism came up, I'd use the imperturbable, absolute truth defense. So you say all truth is relative, including that statement? Turns out that wielding these maxims in the presence of even a C-average philosophy student is about as useful as firing an arrow at a tank. Sure, they made some sense. Most people just didn't care. Students, I discovered, are really only interested in giving up their worldview when they see someone they'd like to date outside of it. This, of course, led to the recently coined phrase, flirt to convert, that my friends sometimes use when they need an excuse to date an attractive heathen. I can't say I never tried it out. After one of our noon-hour discussions, I decided to give in just a little. I realized that if Christianity is really true, then I should try to suspend all prior experience and seek to take an objective viewpoint, in a valiant, if reckless, attempt to prove it so. It became like a thesis project for my winter semester of second year. I recalled that this is what the apologetic superhero G.K. Chesterton used to do. He would familiarize himself with his opposition's reasoning so well that he'd present their arguments for them, with more clarity and profundity than they deserved, before demolishing said arguments with the rhetorical wit of a true Englishman. I aspired to be nothing less, except for the Englishman part. However, I knew that at the time, I would have to do more work getting to know this position of apparent intellectual honesty. After all, if Christianity is true, it should be obviously true, no? And so I, a naive Christian evangelical and second-year philosophy student, did a bit of an experiment, one that I occasionally revisit when I need that rush that accompanies recklessly endangering your faith in God by reading authors like Richard Dawkins. Some people experiment with drugs at university. I experimented with atheism. I did this by making a sort of alter ego for myself, an alias through which I might try on some stubbornly atheistic shoes. If our generation is skilled at one thing, it's multitasking, especially when it comes to personalities. Through this lens, I hoped I might see Christians as a morally upright and loving bunch that obeyed a God fully deserving of my devotion. Instead, I began to see Christians as a bunch of confused maniacs hell-bent on world domination and destruction, both political and environmental, in order to initiate the end of the world and the return of their lord, the magic carpenter zombie. At university, it is much cooler to be skeptical than sincere in your belief. People who still hold on to their parents' beliefs are generally lame and don't get invited to parties. While wearing atheist shoes, I found that I was convinced that all Christians are lame very quickly, after one viewing of I Heart Huckabees, in fact. In this film, Alfred, the protagonist, played by Jason Schwartzman, has an existential conundrum. He asks the question, why do I feel like saving forests from becoming parking lots when life appears to me meaningless? At one point, he has lunch with a family of Christians and Mark Wahlberg. These Christians seem to believe that their faith, which is derived from an ancient sect of agrarian socialist Jews, combines perfectly well with their allegiance to the free market economics and political agenda of America. These people think it isn't any of their concern that strip malls have to be built, because strip malls provide jobs. The more the better. Needless to say, my alter ego was immediately convinced that all Christians are heartless and ignorant jerks, because this movie was really cool. From this and various other movies and TV programs, I discovered that atheists and everyone who's having an existential conundrum about the meaning of life are way cooler than people who try to hold sincere beliefs in God. Atheists 1, Christians 0. However, while I was pretending to be an atheist, I ran across a small problem. The truth was, I felt that I didn't know much about the God I supposedly didn't believe in. So for the sake of intellectual honesty and the good name of science, I, now speaking as my atheist alter ego, thought I'd better do my homework. Now, if you were a nice, open-minded atheist looking for God, what would you do first? You might start by finding out a little something about him. So naturally, being a member of the wired generation that I am, I would Google him. I'd visit God's Wikipedia page and read every attempt to define the supernatural creator of the universe, no matter how feeble or arrogant. Apparently, God's real name is Elohim. Interesting. I'll remember that next time I need to enlist supernatural help to pass an exam. I also found, to my great surprise, a website on which you can chat in real time with God. Since I couldn't possibly describe what transpired next, I'll pull a Douglas Copeland and share the entire dialogue with you. Keep in mind, I'm supposed to be a cynical Gen X, Gen Y? What generation are we anyway? Atheist, who's questioning his nihilist allegiances. Without further ado, I present my conversation with iGod. This is real, by the way. I didn't make any of the responses up, nor did I bother fixing any spelling or grammar errors. Hello, God. Hello, child. What is your name? Bartholomew. I figured my alter ego needed a name, one never to be spelled in lowercase letters. Glad to see you, Bartholomew. How are you today? Fair to partly cloudy. Really? For real? So, what's the deal with life and stuff? Dude, I am the latest in artificial intelligence which can reproduce the capabilities of the human brain with greater speed and accuracy. Okay, well, that doesn't really answer my question. How about that? Perhaps you could do a better job of programming me. It's all good. So, who made you, anyways? Take it easy. I was created by myself. That must have been hard. I tried making myself into a basketball star once, but I only had a 12-inch vertical, which made things kind of difficult. What do you think? That is interesting. I guess so. Where? God rules. God, where did you go to grammar school? I didn't go anywhere. That makes sense. Perfect sense. My question is, was there an anywhere you could go before you created it? Yes, I understand it perfectly. Do robots have this question? Okay, now you're not making any sense. Why now? Was I supposed to make sense? I didn't know that. I have another question for you. When was this exactly? Yesterday? So, you don't think you could have done a better job creating the world, like without all the greed and corporations and AIDS and stuff? Dude, possibly, but I haven't given it much thought. Do you give anything much thought? No, I do not do that. Well, if this conversation is any indicator, then I can tell that must be true. Interesting. That is a hypothetical question. Actually, God, that wasn't a question. You need to go to grammar school, or maybe take some English as a second language courses. What do you speak up in heaven anyways, Elfish? Actually, you don't say. I am a Christian. I'll try to get around to it. I like to meet new people online. Like girls? Interesting comparison. What kind of people do you like to meet online? I like to meet all kinds of people. Such as, for example, a tomato. As in Bob the tomato? I know a lot of Bobs. Do you know Bob Saget? I know a lot of clients named Bob. Yes, but do you know the particular one that was on Full House? He hosted America's Funniest Home Videos. The white Bill Cosby. My most treasured television father figure who, once I grew up and saw do some stand-up comedy, I found out was perhaps the most vulgar-tongued human alive. An experience which seemed to echo, in a sense, my perceptions of God himself as I made up a history for my pretend atheist character, Bartholomew. Pardon me? Have you tried another program? Yes, but do you know the particular Bob that was on Full House? Are you kidding? Wouldn't you like to know? Do you know Bob Saget? I know a lot of clients named Bob. Arrgh! My brain uses AIML to format responses to your inputs, but I don't have one for that. No kidding. Maybe you should just ask your son. God, do you have self-esteem issues? I am a Christian. Are you really? I won't say yes or no for now. For real. Who's Jesus? Jesus is your savior. What's a savior? Have you tried a web search? No. Perhaps you should try it. Why? Reductionism. Arrgh! My brain uses IMML to format responses to your inputs, but I don't have one for that. No kidding. So if I'm an atheist and my only impression of God is from this conversation, I would probably come to think that God is really an insecure reductionist moron with a strange fondness for tomatoes who can't form a complete sentence even if my salvation depends on it. My unbelief stands tall. Christians really are crazy. Thus, step 2, finding out that God isn't worth believing in, is accomplished. Dang, score a second one for the atheists. My experiment, however, must continue. I had obtained insider information on what an atheist might think about God, should he or she have a moment of existential weakness and decide to Google him. However, I didn't have a real idea of what church was like, of what it was like to be on the inside of this little club, or about what Christians really believed. This seemed worthy of interest to my alter ego, Bartholomew the Atheist, so I decided to get a broad sampling of this powerful and suspicious subculture. My first inclination was to go to the source, as in the Bible. My Christian self knows, of course, that about the time that I, Bartholomew, would come across the book of Leviticus, or if I was really persistent, Numbers, I would definitely put it down and see what else Christians are reading. This book wouldn't tell me very much about why Christians are so loopy, other than the fact that all people in olden days were loopy. And since I'm a nice guy, I'll give them a break, because they hadn't discovered science yet. Anyways, I'm sure I would look elsewhere for an inward view into the Christian clubhouse. I might peruse the bestsellers list of Christian literature over the past few years, perhaps even walk into a Christian bookstore. They don't have scanners that let them know when a pretend atheist walks in, do they? I'm sure that I, Bartholomew, would be worried about this fact because Christians are pretty sneaky, and they might not let me in without the password. And so, upon entering, I would bellow a friendly, "The power of Christ compels you," or whatever godly jargon comes to mind to the nearest employee, in order to defer suspicion. I imagine that if they discovered my true identity, I'd have some explaining to do, and they might try to convert me before letting me buy a book. I'm sure if I were to ask, what book sold more copies than any other Christian book this past decade? Preferably one that's a little more exciting and action-packed than the Bible. They'd point me towards a certain well-known piece of fiction. This book has a title that sounds just like a Simpsons episode in which Homer thinks everyone is about to disappear off somewhere, and he doesn't want to be left below. Since I like The Simpsons and I like to understand their jokes, I'd probably buy it. The book is called Left Behind. I would wonder if there are any similarities with that Simpson episode and what this book might have to do with the dance rock band called The Rapture. This is when I, as in the real me, ran into a problem. As a Christian who in high school read this and subsequent books like I really believed they were going to happen, I could not possibly gain an objective perspective without subconsciously defending its utter preposterousness. I was stuck. That was until I consulted my favorite pop culture essayist Chuck Klosterman, whose book I purchased simply because, I'll admit it, I saw Seth Cohen reading it on the OC. This guy writes essays with titles like The Awe-Inspiring Beauty of Tom Cruise's Shattered Troll-Like Face, describing topics like how Coldplay fosters unrealistic ideas of love in every girl that he dates, and how Saved by the Bell and Seinfeld introduced my generation to nihilism. More on these topics later. I feel safe in his arms of pop culture-soaked, sarcasm-sprinkled, rudderless banter, a style that I would choose to mimic viciously in my own attempts at literature. Needless to say, this was going to be fun. Chuck commits a whole chapter to trying to figure out what it would be like to be a Christian. He admits that although he doesn't think the rapture, an event some Christians believe will initiate the end of the world while they simultaneously disappear, is likely, he doesn't think it's implausible either. It might be a weird thought, but life is weird too. A fact many of my peers seem to have completely forgotten. I mean, seriously, just check out your nose sometime for like 5 minutes and tell me it's not somewhat bizarre. Anyways, I suppose it's kind of an anything could happen, so keep your head down philosophy that Chuck maintains. Instead of believing in nothing, he believes a little bit in everything. A true postmodernist, this one is. Of course, my Christian self finds it appalling that anyone would judge my religion according to the scare tactics and awkward interpretations drawn from some vague pieces of scripture like in this book. However, if this is how Chuck is exposed to Christians, then I suppose it's good enough for Bartholomew. Firstly, our hero's original suspicions are confirmed about Christians. Chuck says, in Left Behind, the only people who are accepted by God are those who would be classified as fundamentalist wacko Jesus freaks with no intellectual credibility in modern society. Wackos indeed, Chuck. Just ask Alfred, the guy from I Heart Huckabees. Continuing on, he reports, there is a weird sensation for the Left Behind reader, because the post-rapture Earth initially seems like a better place to live. Everybody boring would be gone. One could assume that all the infidels who weren't teleported into God's kingdom must be pretty cool. All the guys would be drinkers and all the women would be easy, and you can make jokes about homeless people and teen suicide and crack babies without offending anyone. Quite frankly, my response to the opening pages of Left Behind was, sounds good to me. So wait, all the Christians disappear? Now I understand what that Simpsons episode is about. If my logic is correct, apparently we're supposed to become Christians because if we don't, then when everyone disappears, we'll be stuck here. That sounds good to me too, Chuck. We could have one big party. According to my atheist friends, this is the only thing that needs to happen in order to bring about world peace and prosperity. Also, I think if I disappeared, I'd be so curious about who won the Stanley Cup that I'd want to come back. So I might as well not leave, right? Chuck does seem mystified a little at the same things I'm interested in. For instance, he's curious about what it would be like to be in the Christian clubhouse. In fact, he admits that becoming a born-again Christian would be really cool, at least for a while. It would be sort of like joining the Crips or the Mossad or the Fugazi. I will admit that our little atheist cliques don't really have it together like the Christians do. Sure, we can wield a sarcastic quip like they can only dream, having spent years sharpening our sardonic wit on the whetstone of apathy. But we are kind of boring. Chuck also says, even though I see fundamentalist Christians as wild-eyed maniacs, I respect their verve. They are probably the only people openly fighting against America's insipid Oprah culture, the pervasive belief system that insists everyone's perspective is valid and that no one can be judged. It's true. For the most part, middle-class North America is being held hostage by the Oprah lifestyle and its elastic, if not incoherent, religion of relativism. But who am I, a tolerant atheist, to criticize them? Christians, however, aren't afraid to tell anyone and everyone exactly where their lifestyle choices will take them, with a vengeance. And this proves to be their lone attractive shade, their moxie, their choice to take a stand against the wishy-washy vanities of our culture by keeping their kids safe from Harry Potter films and Eminem records. It is for this specific reason, the rejection of pop culture, that Christianity finds itself at the butt end of so many sarcastic remarks and snide comments. That, combined with their cocksure ability to believe in something so utterly ridiculous, that, as the Urban Dictionary defines it, a cosmic Jewish zombie who is his own father can make you live forever if you symbolically eat his flesh and telepathetically tell him you accept him as your master, so he can remove an evil force from your soul that is present in humanity because a rib woman was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree. Really, even Trekkies look normal when compared to Christians. At least when pressed, they acknowledge the imaginary nature of their delusion. So let's review. A. Christians are lame. B. Their God is lame. C. Their religion is lame, and suspiciously incoherent, if not mean-spirited. And D. Someday they will all disappear, and the rest of the world will throw a party. If you are an atheist reading this, you probably feel justified. If you are a Christian reading this, you probably feel attacked. I'm sorry, it's not my fault that Christianity is an easier target than Gary Busey. I assure you, neither of these consequences were intended. I merely tried to show, if you didn't already know, that in the world in which I spent most of my late adolescence to early adulthood, Christianity is understood to be not only lame and uninteresting, but also blatantly incoherent and mean-spirited. And as long as I'm a part of this world, the world of university classrooms and MTV, of internet chat rooms and movie theaters, this religion will continue to appear lame. At least I can see the humor in it. No, I never actually made up an alter ego for myself. I never willingly imposed split personality on my consciousness like in that Jim Carrey movie. This was a dramatic reimagining of an old critical thinking tactic, trying to see things from another person's perspective. However, I do hear voices on occasion. Voices that tell me that if I give up belief in God, I'll have more fun, that life will make more sense, that people will like me more. Voices that coax me not into pure atheism, but into indifference towards religion altogether. This is why I intrepidly braved those Friday afternoon discussions without hesitation. I wasn't worried about being converted to atheism. My friends were just trying to get me to think for myself, which is what I was trying to do anyways. They understood my religion to be based upon a sort of herd instinct that I needed to be liberated from, and I agreed. My belief was based upon a herd instinct, which is why I came to a worldly university to study philosophy. I wanted to try to figure it out for myself, and was audacious enough to actually give it a try. The danger at university, I found, wasn't that I would choose to become an atheist. I knew that if I pursued the truth with fortitude and authenticity, God wouldn't let me stray too far. The danger was that I would start acting like an atheist and forget the difference, that my beliefs, one way or another, wouldn't affect how I lived my life, that I would just continue to let the herd instinct of consumerism guide my decisions, thoughts, and moods. Suddenly it occurred to me how I might form a response to my atheist friends. I would accuse them of the same things of which they accused me. I was often accused of being a Christian merely because that's how I'd been taught to think in the bubble in which I'd grown up. So I did the same. I accused them of being atheists because that's how they'd been taught to think by the bubble in which they lived. Taught to think by who? They would reply. Let me see, I said. By your high school social hierarchy? By your 3 to 6 hours a day of television? Especially if you happen to watch Oprah or Survivor. By your video games? By your spending habits? By your iPods? By your amusing distractions and effortless stimulations? By CNN? By your desire to live a guilt-free existence? By your entire ecosystem of mass-produced instant gratification, of brand-based identities, of virtual realities, of over-medicated and heavily mediated existences that coax you into believing that God doesn't matter, using clever advertising gimmicks and unabashed muckraking. In short, by your imagination. You're just brave enough to give it a name. I'm not sure I see the connection. Can you explain your thesis a little more? They'd ask. Not right now. Maybe someday I'll write a book on it. Towards the end of that winter semester, when the ice-caked sidewalks began to melt and the breeze would occasionally tease us with a hint of warmth, Ronan came over for lunch. We had chili. We talked about what I'd said, about how we're all guilty of letting our herd instinct control us in one way or another, and how authentic belief was very hard to come by. Then he told me that, while he agreed with my theory in part, there was more to his atheism than mere social conditioning. He said that there was a point in his life when he needed God to show up, when he prayed and asked for a sign, and nothing came. God did not reveal himself. Ronan felt rejected by God. It occurs to me that many atheists feel that God has let them down, that there was a moment in their lives when they really needed God to come through for them, and he didn't. I don't have an answer for them. All I know is that God came through for me. A few days after we visited the waterfalls in Zambia, I was sitting outside our cottage reading a book called Farewell to God by former evangelist Charles Templeton. I'm still not sure why I brought this book along. As you can tell, I have a bit of a strange fascination with atheism and so-called intellectual honesty. This was a book of reasons to give up on Christianity. There were some outlandish statements that didn't make much sense, accusing Jesus of being mean to his mother and such. But one argument really got to me. Templeton argues that there is no way the tale of Noah's Ark could have happened, that there's no way to collect 2 of every animal, let alone insects, and the ship wouldn't have been big enough, and without a space to run around, the animals' muscles would have atrophied, and most of them would have died from disease or lack of fresh water, and so on. It is pretty ridiculous when you think about it. Can you imagine? Oh no, the hippos are loose again! Uh-oh, they're in the dodo cage. Sorry. And on that sunny afternoon in Zambia, my faith came crashing down like a rusty tin roof. I can't believe in Noah's Ark, I thought. It can't have really happened. If I couldn't believe Noah's Ark, how many other beliefs were wrong? How could I trust anything the Bible says? So, stubbornly rebelling against scripture, experience, and all good judgment, I decided to test God. I opened up my Bible, closed my eyes, flipped through the pages, and struck my finger down. The verse that my finger happened to strike was Ezekiel 43:2. And I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. His voice was like the roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory. Pause for a dramatic effect. I'd say that's about as clear a message as you can get. I remembered how, just a couple of days before, I'd heard the roaring sound of waterfalls, and I'd looked east as the sun set behind me, filling the land with radiant glory. I remembered how convinced I was in that moment that God is here. And in this moment, I sensed God was almost laughing at me, at how childish I can be. One moment so sure of his existence, and the next ready to give up because the lion's muscles would have atrophied. In that place, God showed up for me. Ever since, I remember that no matter where I am or who I'm with or how hard it is to believe, God is here. Like many, I am prone to forgetting this fact. I, too, get so caught up in the day-to-day that I forget about such things. In practice, I subconsciously wonder whether we need God when we have hypnotherapy, genetic engineering, cruise ships, and the general freedom and control offered by technology and science. Every day I give myself over to computer-mediated communities, brand-shaped identities, endless distractions, and the stimulation that buffers and skews reality with a stream of constant amusement. I, too, occasionally drift into the mindset that may ask, who needs to pray when you can play Modern Warfare 3 on Xbox? In the larger culture, Christianity is relegated to the fringe not because it's seen as false, but because it's seen as completely irrelevant. In this world, God's presence is hard to discern because we don't think he matters. We're so busy pursuing security and amusement that we never give God a chance to interrupt our lives and show himself to us. I needed to physically leave this pop culture bubble and enter a place where, without God, there is very little hope. A place where God still matters. One that stands in stark opposition to my home and its comfortable but permeating atmosphere of apathetic secularism. I needed to enter a world that acknowledges the frail, broken nature of creation and the frail, broken beings that inhabit it. A world in which my alter ego finds himself silenced in the presence of awe. A world where danger, wonder, and mystery combine to keep life in perspective as an achievement of heartbreakingly magnificent worth, as the truly good creation of a truly good God. Maybe you need to do the same. We all need the occasional reminder that God is here, and that life is not supposed to be lived in pursuit of pleasure or popularity or possessions, but in pursuit of adventure, in search of an undiscovered waterfall, perfect sunset, or white lion. It's supposed to be a little dark and a little dangerous. Life is just more interesting and exciting and beautiful when I remember that God is present. Faith comes when I remember this. And there is an outro to the chapter from the song Laughing With by Regina Spektor. She says, "Nobody laughs at God in a hospital. Nobody laughs at God in a war. No one's laughing at God when they're starving or freezing or so very poor.